Hi, everyone. Welcome to Listening to Lancaster. I'm Diana Martin with Hourglass, and it's my pleasure to be joined today by Chad Martin, no relation, Executive Director of Chestnut Housing. Thanks so much for being here today, Chad.
Thanks, Diana. I am delighted to be having a conversation with you. Thanks for asking.
And I know we want to get into some bigger topics around affordable housing in Lancaster County, but let's start by talking more about your organization. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do at Chestnut Housing and how you got started?
Yeah, absolutely. So Chestnut Housing has been around for about a dozen years or so. We were founded by members of East Chestnut Street Mennonite Church, which is in downtown Lancaster, and has an over a century long history as a congregation of being active in its neighborhood, supporting neighbors, especially providing programming for folks living with lower incomes. And really growing out of that long legacy, a number of members kind of came forward about a dozen years ago with this kind of burning question around what the congregation could do to support housing differently. They were especially seeing folks who are unhoused passing through their doors and recognizing that like long-term housing solutions were a big part of the challenge being faced by folks they serve. So they set out literally with this question of like, we do not want to create some sort of cumbersome organization. We do not want to get bogged down in like years of church meetings to decide whether we have the ability to do this. Can we like just buy a house and see what happens? Um, so they did that about a dozen years ago, right out of the gate, set up a separate organization that has been alongside East Chestnut Street for all these years and supported in really deep and meaningful ways by the congregation, but we do exist as a separate nonprofit organization. Um, so we provide affordable rental housing for folks who've experienced homelessness. We work with a wide range of local partners, agencies that your listeners would be familiar with, like Tenfold, CAP, Milagro House, Bridge of Hope, folks like that. And our real strength is identifying housing that can be either adapted or created for affordable rental housing, and doing that affordably with a mix of donated capital, um, branching now into some public funding sources as well, but really using a mix of creative capital sources along with a pretty substantial amount of volunteer labor to rehabilitate properties. Um, and that makes it possible for us to pass those savings on to our residents who live with us. So we now operate 22 apartments and homes, all currently in the city of Lancaster. We also have a number of kind of redevelopment and infill projects in the pipeline, which are really exciting for us. Next month, we'll start construction on an 8 apartment development called Milburn Apartments on Rockland Street in the city. We just got site control to purchase the former Strawberry Hill restaurant properties a few months ago, which will be a mix of office space for our organization, plus about 8 to 12 apartments mixed in as well. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do. There's lots of detail behind that, but kind of the end goal is providing creative solutions for affordable rental housing and really doing that from a history of working closely with people of faith who are committed to helping solve these issues in our community.
We have a lot of exciting projects in the pipeline. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about them as we go along, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the households that you serve. I feel like so often when we talk about affordable housing, it's statistics. We know how many renters are cost burdened in Lancaster County or how many affordable housing units that we need. I mean, who are the people that you're serving, and what are their stories or situations that they end up in need of the housing units that you're providing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. I'll share a couple anecdotes about residents that I've gotten to know that we serve. But I think it's important to know we work with a broad range of agencies who approach homelessness services in a variety of ways. So that means we serve a mix of families and individuals. As you can imagine, many of the families who fall into homelessness are single parent households with children who are really struggling, even if working full time, to make ends meet between childcare needs and housing needs and things like that. So we have a mix of individuals and families. One great example I think of is a woman named Kayla that we feature on our website who moved into one of our apartments. I believe it was now about 6 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer. who fell into homelessness around the same time she became pregnant with her first child, and went through the Milagro House program, through their kind of residential program that helped her kind of regain her footing. She's now been living in one of our apartments for 5 or 6 years, doing really well. She works full time. Her son's now, I guess, what does that make him? Like 6 or 7 years old. He's really thriving. And for her, it's really created like she really thinks of her apartment as her home. Obviously she's a long-term renter. She doesn't own it directly, but for her, it's become home in a way that she didn't experience before. And she's been able to create a much more stable life. They're on the east side of the city, consistent school opportunities for her son. It's created a lot of consistency and stability. And I think we experience that a lot. I think of homelessness, folks who experience homelessness, there's kind of like a wide range of extreme. Unfortunately, like the one extreme that many of us think of is folks we may pass by who are literally living unhoused on the street, maybe in a local park or something like that, or we see tent encampments in our own community or others that we visit. That's like one slice of who experiences homelessness, and that's folks who are thought of as more chronically homeless, and in many cases really, really challenging to provide long-term housing solutions. Doesn't mean we shouldn't all be striving for that, but it's a whole different sort of set of needs. The profile of most folks we serve looks really different. People who have like fallen into a series of crises that kind of stack up in a way that make it really hard to remain housed. And for some folks that we serve, like Kayla, that may really only like happen once in their life, and the right like support network around them helps them regroup and they like find stability again and really move forward into a positive trajectory. Doesn't mean it's always just like uphill without bumps along the way, but usually in a great trajectory. We see a lot of other folks who might cycle in and out of stability every handful of years. And I'd say one of the biggest challenges and opportunities for an organization like ours is how do you create a framework with enough support in place that when a household like that falls into crisis again, they have the tools they need to make their way through it without losing their housing. The mix of like, if you suddenly like have your car break down and lose your job and have another kid all at the same time, thinking of someone we've been working with who's really struggling to stay in her apartment with us. And it's like, how do you make that work when like you had another kid, lost your job, and your car breaks down and all that stacking up? What are the right supports to make it possible to not slip back into that experience of homelessness again? I would say just another quick sort of snapshot of what this looks like. We serve a number of folks who are like middle age to senior ages who are more likely single, more likely to be living either on Social Security or disability payments, which frankly, Diana, like in the economy we're in right now, like rents have gone up a lot. Incomes actually for a lot of different bands across the country have gone up a lot. But for folks living on a fixed income, like a disability payment, they're still living with exceptionally low incomes, like maybe $1,200 a month. Like, how do you, like, that's the average rent for an apartment in Lancaster County right now is like more than that. So, how do you live on that when that's literally like what you have month after month, and you're living with a disability that prevents you from working a full-time job? So, we have a lot of folks in that kind of situation where, like, an efficiency apartment, it honestly like stretches what they can afford, but an efficiency apartment that's like $500 a month is a huge win just to like kind of find stability in that kind of housing situation.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you got into this work. I know you've been in this role of executive director, I think about the last year and a half as the first executive director of
Mhm.
Chestnut Housing. Your background, you're a pastor, you're a carpenter, you're a farmer. How did you get called into this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't always know how to like navigate that path in a way that makes sense for folks who haven't been on the journey with me. But I have essentially spent my career in the nonprofit sector going back now more than 25 years. Began actually as an art teacher with middle and high school students in Pittsburgh, where my wife and I lived for about a decade. But actually, through that work, had an opportunity to do a lot of neighborhood-based work, including helping found a nonprofit organization in Pittsburgh that we lived in, that found a way to purchase an abandoned church building and convert it into a community center with a diverse array of programs, including a lot of economic empowerment goals. The nonprofit where I taught art, like I was an art teacher for my day job, but it was primarily working with underserved students in the Pittsburgh public school system. So I really became in touch with the kind of diversity of needs that folks face. And my wife and I, until very recently, have lived most of our lives in low income, mixed race urban neighborhoods that really like brought me in touch firsthand with the housing challenges that neighbors often were facing, and also kind of like living out and living in the midst of what does community and economic development look like in low income neighborhoods. So yeah, I have not like officially worked in housing my whole life, but going all the way back, 25 plus years, I've been kind of just immersed in the big picture questions around how you create sustainable neighborhoods that work for a variety of incomes. That's the early roundabout answer. And then I've done lots of different things over the last 15, 20 years in Lancaster, including, as you said, being a pastor, which really equipped me we work really deeply with a wide array of communities of faith at Chestnut Housing. And that work equipped me to not be surprised by the quirky way that congregations work with their local partners. So, yeah.
Well, let's talk about some of the big picture questions when it comes to housing. I think, we hear about affordable housing all the time now. I think a lot of people in the community understand that there's a need for affordable housing really across the US and here in Lancaster County. The most recent statistic I have heard and seen is that we need about 20,000 more affordable housing units just to meet the need here in Lancaster County. So, as someone who's on the ground doing this work, what are some of the barriers to making that happen? Why is it so hard to address affordable housing? And how can we start chipping away at it?
Yeah. So as your listeners may be aware, and I think there really is more coverage and more attention drawn to these issues in recent years than we have seen like for decades, which is good. I mean, I think it's a result of how acute the crisis is, but I think people are gaining in their understanding of what is going on behind and underneath that crisis. Um, I mean, the first thing to say, Diane, is affordable housing is like a really complex challenge, both locally and nationally. The causes are complex. The barriers for lower income households are complex. I mean, frankly, like incomes have really shifted since the pandemic, but historically, if you look back at the last like 40 years, incomes have really lagged behind cost of living increases for lower income households. And I think that means, people have been behind the eight ball for a long time. And maybe the last couple of years, statistically, people are catching up, but what that really looks like on the ground is still very challenging for many households. So like one version of the answer, which could take us to a whole different podcast, is what are the income challenges for lower income households that make housing and literally everything else hard to afford. But setting that aside, I think the like biggest and broadest challenge that we all face is that simply the last 30 to 40 years across the country, and this is also true in Lancaster, for all the development you see going on, for all the challenges of like suburban sprawl that we see in our own community, for all the like high rises you see being built in downtown Lancaster, we have not built enough housing to meet demand across the country, especially in communities that are desirable places to live, like Lancaster County. So, you could look at the statistics nationally and say maybe we have enough housing, but it's distributed in ways where desirable places to live have become really expensive because we don't build housing fast enough. Like building housing is slow and cumbersome. It's not a nimble enterprise. And so I think that's in the biggest in the biggest sense, it's a supply and demand challenge. There are lots of other challenges kind of embedded in that around, you know, landlords who raise prices just because they can, and that makes things challenging. Landlords who don't take care of properties, which becomes its own set of challenges. when communities do become more competitive, you have lots of like house flipping things, which it doesn't help that we now have like an entire TV network dedicated to everyone making their house more beautiful and more valuable. Like there are just a lot of factors that contribute, but at the end of the day, we simply need more housing. As you said, in the case of Lancaster County, tens of thousands of units of affordable housing. Um, and so I think for us, like we have shifted our mission in the early days when we were just getting started. The easiest pathway to get a foothold was acquiring existing rental housing and rehabilitating it to be sure it's quality housing and then preserving it as affordable housing. But we're increasingly seeing that with new opportunities to grow and the needs of our community, we need to be contributing to creating more housing so that there are more options for folks on the table.
Let's bring that to life with what you're seeing on the ground. You mentioned two projects, new projects for Chestnut Housing that you're part of, the Milburn apartment projects and the redevelopment of the former Strawberry Hill restaurant. I mean, just help us understand how long will it take to finish one of those projects? What will it cost? Where do you have to get funding? What are some of the hoops that you have to jump through? Just help us kind of illustrate your experience of how long it might take just to get in 8 unit or 12 units of affordable housing live.
Yeah. So we're building a successful track record at Chestnut Housing of creating missing middle housing, which some of your listeners may be familiar with that term. It's a little bit sort of like buzzwordy right now, but I do find it a helpful way to think about what we're doing, which means creating, not creating high-rise, large multifamily developments like 50 to 200 apartments, not creating single family homes, but creating things that are in the middle of that, maybe low rise apartment buildings of like 5 to 15 apartments, something like that. Creating quadplexes where a single family home used to be. That's kind of where we're finding our bread and butter. The challenges of that and some of the barriers are that creating 8 apartments in some ways includes many of the same uh, planning steps and expenses as building an apartment building of say 50 apartments. Obviously the total numbers are smaller in terms of dollar cost, but some of the same expenses are there regardless of how big the development is. So in the case of our 8 apartment development at Milburn, we first were awarded site control of those properties from the city's redevelopment authority about 2 years ago. So in summer of 2022, we began securing funding, and that took most of the last 2 years to really get everything we need there, although most of that was in place after about a year. That project includes a mix of public and private sources with a total project cost of about $2.2 million. So that works out to something like $275,000 per apartment.
And that's with volunteer labor too that you're
That
your
includes
project.
that includes about $80,000 worth of volunteer labor incorporated in the project, which is literally like that may sound like a small percentage of 2.2 million, but that is literally the difference maker between we have the money to afford to do this or we don't. So for us, that is a real significant piece. Yeah, so about $2.2 million with additional volunteer labor on top of that. For folks who have not built a house anytime recently, that may sound like an unusually large number, but if you track other projects going on in Lancaster, that is similar or more affordable than many, both affordable and market rate developments going on when you look at kind of per apartment costs. So that frankly is sort of the price of doing business these days if you want to create quality new housing. Doesn't mean there aren't some creative ways to do it cheaper, but it's incredibly hard to get the numbers much lower than that. So we're about to start construction, as I said, next month. We've had a couple delays, which anyone who has built an apartment building recently also experiences those. The 2 properties that we're working on there involve rehabilitating 2 severely fire damaged and then subsequently weather decayed buildings. So there are some unique engineering and demolition challenges. They're also attached on one side, as many as many city properties are, they're attached to other homes, so we have to treat that really carefully. So we've had a couple minor delays as we sort out those pieces, but if all goes well, we'll start construction very soon and then likely be ready to lease those up like the end of next winter.
Okay, so yeah, you're looking at least it could be a 3, 4 year timeline to get a project like this off the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, we will probably be from like the day we were awarded site control, which is not the same as actually owning the properties. It was a little bit later till we actually owned them. But from the time we were awarded site control until we have folks living in the apartments, in our case, it'll probably be about 2 years, 9 months, something like that, which is actually, frankly, like pretty fast compared to some projects like this going on around the city. So yeah, 2 to 4 years, totally normal. Longer than that also happens like all the time. Less than that, virtually impossible.
And what are your expectations for the redevelopment of the Strawberry Hill restaurant? I know this is a very new project that you're in the very early stages of. It's an exciting one because it's mixed use. You mentioned there'll be some community space, office space, apartments. And what does a timeline or a price tag look like for a project like that? Knowing that a redevelopment project is a little bit more complicated than just starting at a greenfield site somewhere out in the county.
Yeah, totally. So far, we are very early in the planning phases. So I would say the project numbers are likely to shift a little bit up or down as we move forward. But our current plans are to create office space both for our organization, which currently doesn't have a permanent office home, as well as space for another community partner. We're exploring sharing space with the SOE initiative, which folks in the city are likely familiar with, a great neighborhood-based, really one of the few kind of truly neighborhood-based community development organizations in Lancaster. They're looking at new office space, and if all goes well, we'll be sharing that space. And as you indicated, provides some opportunity to have some community meeting space there as well. These are, historic properties with a deep legacy going back a couple hundred years. And the buildings that are there now were built like 100 plus years ago. So, it's a project we want to do very thoughtfully and carefully in how we rehabilitate them. In addition to the office space, we'll have 8 to 12 apartments. It's looking likely that'll be like 10 or 11. So that's, 2 commercial units plus 10 apartments is 12 units. Our current price tag that we're estimating is about $3.3 million, which is right on track for the same kind of per unit cost as we're experiencing at Milburn Apartments. So if that holds, that would be fantastic. If we can build something a couple years later and still have a similar kind of per unit cost. The timeline, honestly, Diana, will look similar, like probably a year and a half to 2 years of securing financing, securing all public approvals, and making an appropriate plan that takes into account neighborhood input and things like that. And then probably about a year of construction after that.
Let's switch gears and talk about policy. I'd love to hear your thoughts on if there's policy changes either at the local level, maybe state level, that would make it easier to build affordable housing or support affordable housing initiatives. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll try to keep that succinct, but thank you for asking about that. This is something I care about a lot, and I think as a smaller organization, finding a way to have a seat at the table with policymakers has been really exciting and an opportunity for us to sort of like punch above our weight, so to speak, to try to do our part around advocating for appropriate policy solutions, regardless of the number of units we're actually able to operate ourselves. So a couple things I think about really, like, given the supply and demand challenges we're facing and the causes behind that lagging supply, I think of like two overarching causes, both of which could have policy solutions. One is like we simply need more money. Like any housing that is affordable in an income restricted way, where the rents are below market rate rents, like it costs the same to build it. So what that means is you have a gap in funding if you're going to charge people lower rent. So it's a very simple like math equation. You need money from somewhere in order to do that. The marketplace simply isn't designed to create affordable housing for people in the world we live in. So money is one piece, and the other piece is we have we have created a confusing maze of zoning and other regulatory challenges that make it really hard to build things. On In terms of national voices talking about this, Diana, some folks your listeners may be interested in are Ezra Klein at the New York Times is doing a great job these days of talking about this a lot with his podcast guests and his own research around like what's making it hard to build things in the United States. And there's a lot that's in there about like the complicated way we regulate housing and other industries. Um, so on the policy front, like there are things we can do about that. There is great legislation at the state level right now in Pennsylvania that would advocate for some simple changes to our municipal code that would do things like rather than having an array of zoning districts across the state that only allow for single family detached homes to be built, that every zoning district would have to allow at least duplexes or maybe even up to quadplexes as a by right requirement on any residential parcel across the state. Those would make a huge difference. There are many examples in Lancaster County where you can only build a single family detached home, but you could, if allowable, you could build a 2 or 3 apartment building that's like a similar scale to the houses around it, would have similar parking demands, and really would have like no discernible different impact on its neighborhood, but would house 3 households or 2 households instead of one. Um, we need like some simple zoning tweaks that make it possible to do things like that in our community. And it would be great to solve that at the state level, but I'm certainly engaged with some folks locally who are trying to advocate for similar things at the local level.
Yeah, I think density scares people because they think it means big high rises. But, an example I like to give, because I grew up in Manham Township, is the Grandview Heights neighborhood, which is a neighborhood people really love in Manham Township. And there's a lot of density there because a lot of it is not just single family homes. There's a lot of joined homes there. So if you drive through a neighborhood like that, that's also an example of what density could look like, right? There's a lot of range.
Absolutely. That's a great example, Diana. I mean, so we actually have an extended family member who owns a 2 unit investment property in Grandview Heights that's literally within one block in multiple directions of homes that are probably valued at 3 to 500,000 dollars. Very much like middle class to upper middle class households within a block of a duplex that fits right in with the things around it. It is housing 2 households. In this case, they're both. I mean, it's rented privately, but they would both qualify as like probably below market rate apartments. Like that kind of mix we need in so many more places. And yeah, as far as I can tell, has no discernible impact on that neighborhood. Yeah. Another, just to add another example of this, because that's one area that folks think about a lot. Another tweak that could be really valuable for affordable housing developers is simply making it allowable to develop multifamily housing in commercial districts, which is not uniformly allowed. Some commercial districts allow it, some don't. And obviously in some settings that's not appropriate if you're talking about like a hard to navigate kind of heavily used commercial district. But there are lots of commercial districts where a like 20 unit apartment building would fit right in, again, would actually have little discernible impact on things like traffic and parking, and fits in the scale of the commercial things going on around it, and may even create an opportunity for residents to live nearby important services like grocery stores and things like that. Like that in my mind should just be allowable kind of everywhere.
So many people will be familiar with the term NIMBY, not in my backyard. One of the challenges for affordable housing is sometimes local opposition, just neighbors who think affordable housing is a great idea, but they don't necessarily want it in their neighborhood. Um, Recently, I read an article about the YIGBY movement, and I was kind of inspired by this. It's Yes in God's Backyard. So it's a number of really churches and faith-based organizations around the country who are maybe identifying that they have some underutilized land or property and they want to be part of the affordable housing solution. We're seeing this really across the country where churches are looking for ways that they can build some affordable housing, maybe right in their backyard. So I'd love if you could speak a little bit about that. In Lancaster County, we have such strong churches and faith-based organizations. What kind of role do you think that they could play in addressing this need?
Well, Diana, you're like speaking my language, and I will try to give you a compact answer about this, but I could spend another whole episode just talking about this concept. This is work that is really exciting to me, and I think Chestnut Housing is uniquely positioned to work alongside congregations who are compelled by this concept. Certainly, if you look in primarily major metro areas across the country, this has been happening for at least 20 plus years, where congregations are finding ways to either adapt underutilized space in their properties to create affordable housing, to completely reimagine the properties they own to create new affordable housing that's built from the ground up. Um, yeah, lots of examples of this. I was just visiting, for example, this is maybe a year or so ago, visited a congregation in Old City, Philadelphia, that has been there for years and years and years doing uh, all kinds of homelessness outreach programs. And they're in a very like compact urban space, but they owned some adjacent property that was not as fully built out as it could be, given what's around it in Center City, Philadelphia. And they've embarked on a multi-year process to partner with a nonprofit affordable housing developer like Chestnut Housing to create from the ground up an apartment complex. I believe it's going to be 30 some apartments for lower income households, with many of those reserved for folks who have experienced homelessness. So literally like the people that congregation has been like sheltering in their church basement for years and years, they're now creating like permanent apartments that could be homes for those households or similar households in the future. So this is going on around the country. I think Lancaster County is really ripe to explore this more. You know, it's a place that has been traditionally more affordable to live, but as we've all experienced, costs have really skyrocketed in recent years. So this, when costs skyrocket, you start getting creative about new solutions. And I think that with at the same time, many congregations seeing membership decline, seeing church participation go down overall, creates a need for churches to reimagine how they're using their property. There are great urban examples of this, as I said. I think in a place like Lancaster County, there are also lots of rural and suburban congregations that have a lot of green space they own that, I don't know, maybe they thought at one point they would hold for like future growth that has never panned out to happen, or things just change, and as their bottom lines get tighter and congregations get smaller, they're looking at ways to reimagine how that space around them is utilized in a way that's a mission fit for them, and housing can really be that. I'm like, I talk about this with every congregation I visit, Diana, and I would be thrilled to talk with more congregations. Just real quickly, an anecdote of how this is playing out for us. We're partnering with a congregation in the city that had a former parsonage that was then converted to like Sunday school space when they were bursting at the seams decades ago. It's now sat vacant for a number of years. So it has not served housing needs in our community for probably like 50 years. And we're partnering with them to redevelop that property. They'll maintain ownership of it and front most of the cost to rehabilitate it, converting it to 2 apartments that can be used in our program to create affordable housing, literally like 10 feet from their church building. Doesn't change anything about the space they're using in a significant way currently, but is a way to leverage an asset that they control to create more housing for their neighborhood. And it's a super exciting partnership.
Let's talk a little bit about the future, and then I want to make sure we wrap by giving people a chance to find out ways that they can get involved. But I would love to hear kind of your outlook on what's the landscape of affordable housing going to look like in Lancaster County in the next 5 to 10 years, and what does the future of Chestnut housing look like?
Hmm. I think that landscape question has a ton of question marks swirling around it. It depends so much on things like do communities across Lancaster County take hold of the kind of questions we've been wrestling with today and really like own them as their questions and their challenges? You know, do local municipalities look at things like zoning changes that make it possible to create more housing more easily and more quickly in their communities, regardless of whether it's technically affordable housing or not? Getting more housing in their communities overall makes the landscape better and more affordable for more households. So like I think the future is really like kind of open and dependent on those questions. How much do we find solutions for affordable housing, not just in the city of Lancaster, which has growth going on kind of everywhere you turn right now, but how do we see that kind of growth in other parts of the county? I think, you know, municipalities like East Lampeter that are really proactively taking that kind of approach, adapting their zoning code to allow and even encourage more housing development, and then like seeing how that plays out. I mean, they have hundreds of apartments slated to be built in East Lampeter over the next few years. Like, how does that kind of example trickle out to other municipalities? I think that like that's what the future looks like. If we can all do that, then the future can become more affordable and there are just a wider range of options for households on the table. And if not, like we're talking about Lancaster becoming a place that's too expensive for many people's children and grandchildren to afford a home, whether they want to rent it or buy it.
Yeah, and I think East Lampreter is a great example of what you were talking about earlier with some of the, commercial. They're looking at redeveloping the Rockville outlets and adding housing in that shopping complex. So I think that's a great example. How can, if people are listening today and they care about this topic of affordable housing, how can they learn more? How can they get involved? How can they support what you're doing at Chestnut Housing?
Yes, thank you for asking. I would be delighted to hear from anybody listening or watching. The easiest thing to do is just go to our website, chestnuthousing.org, and sign up for our email newsletter, which comes out once or twice a month. We do have many volunteer opportunities for folks to do hands-on work rehabilitating apartments and homes, which in our experience, volunteers find really meaningful. I think in a post-pandemic world where we all experienced what it's like to only live on our computer screens, like people really value the chance to like get dirty and do work where they can see a result at the end of the day that's meaningful and they can see what they did. So we do have lots of opportunities like that. The best way to learn about those is to follow us on email, but folks can reach out to me directly too. My email is just chad, C-H-A-D, at chestnuthousing.org, and would be glad to hear from anybody about ways to get involved. We of course love things like donations and all of that, but yeah,
Yeah, it
love to
costs
see
money to
people
make it happen,
volunteer.
right?
It does. It costs money to make it happen. And we're grateful for many helpful supporters.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time today, Chad. I appreciate everyone who's listening. You can find more episodes of Listening to Lancaster on our YouTube channel or on our website at hourglasslancaster.org. I'll make sure I drop also Chestnut Housing's website, and appreciate getting a snapshot of this conversation. We know it's a big, complex topic, and part of it is also spreading awareness about how people can get involved. So appreciate your time today.
Well, likewise, and thanks for all your great work at Hourglass. You all have been great partners and grateful for the conversation.
Thanks.